Hey guys, welcome to a special edition of the Fieldcraft Survival podcast. Today we are going to do stories of survival, the Shackleton / Endurance Expedition, to you via video, interactive like, as well as audio. So if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't seen the YouTube channel, the Fieldcraft Survival channel, make sure you subscribe so you can see the interactivity that's going on of us dropping the slides and walking you through the history and the journey that is the Shackleton Endurance Expedition. The whole concept between us giving you a historical reference in everything survival is to allow you to understand some lessons learned that you could apply to your life to better your preparedness. The Shackleton / Endurance Expedition is one of the greatest stories of survival, of thriving in a austere environment. So today we got Kevin Owens co-hosting, which he will be co-hosting these stories of survival, SOS, in the future. What we plan to do is try to give you these interactive experiences, but also so you could follow on via audio. Now, Kevin, I know when we started talking about Shackleton, found out he was from Ireland, Kildare County, and one of his main captains, his first shipping mates, was Tom Crean, a very known Irishman who was on this expedition and who was one of the principal reasons that Shackleton was successful.
Yeah, Tom Crean was born in Ireland, joined the Royal Navy at 15 years old, which is pretty common back then. Spent his whole life at sea, but was on several expeditions, super experienced. By the time the Shackleton expedition came about, the one we're going to talk about, he'd already been to the Antarctic twice. And there's a book called Unsung Hero, because he got no credit really, and he was one of the main reasons people made it back from all three expeditions. The reason he was not really given credit is because of a couple of reasons. Number one, he was Irish, and it was an English expedition in a time when England was still occupying Ireland and ruling Ireland. He was basically a second-class citizen. He was Irish. He was enlisted, and which at that time with the class system, it was way worse than it is now. Although it is still there, but officers got all the credit, all the glory, and enlisted were just there to kind of facilitate that. And then the third reason was he didn't really write a journal. He was not really well educated, leaving school at like 14, and he didn't keep a journal like a lot of guys did. So a lot of his exploits, a lot of his really heroic deeds were told by other people. So that's kind of why he wasn't at the forefront of publicity and glory after this. And one other reason, when he came back to Ireland, his brother was in the police force. Again, the British were still occupying Ireland, and he was killed by the IRA, an earlier version of the IRA. But so he kind of kept his exploits quiet because he didn't want people to know he was in the Royal Navy. And so all those things combined kind of pushed him into obscurity and history. But, people have written books about him and his family, and there's been documentaries. So he was a super squared away guy, and we'll probably reference him a couple of times during this. But there's a book called Unsung Hero, which I'm reading right now about him. That's really, really good, really well written.
Yeah, you guys should make sure that you understand that this is a glance at the expedition, but there's so much more to this story and people's individual stories fighting through adversity through one of the most difficult of circumstances in modern history. One thing that's really cool about this is it takes place during a time in which many people were fighting for exploration benefits and kudos. And, every country was fighting for their country to be the first to plant a flag because we were truly exploring the world.
Yeah.
We didn't have a lot of understanding or education in science exploration of Antarctica or the Arctic, the North or South Poles. This takes time and a place where Robert Byrd, Robert Peary were making their explorations of the North Pole and the continent of the Arctic, and Antarctica was mainly unexplored. Really, up until this point, everybody was fighting, including the Norwegians, the Brits, and even the Americans. There were some failed and some successful expeditions in their own way, but this was shaped around this time period where exploration and expeditions was the thing.
Yeah, it's like an arms race almost, right? It was for glory of the crown. It came at a time when the British Empire was starting to struggle, and obviously up until that point, the British Empire was all over the world. But there was a lot of revolution going on back then. The World War I broke out. Actually, I think the day they left. After that, the Russian Revolution, where the overthrow of the Romanov family, there was a lot of that going on. So the British were struggling to hang on to their empire, or starting to struggle, and it was seen as like glory for the British. And then the same thing, you had all these colonial powers from Europe that wanted to be the people who discovered Antarctica. Like when you look at it, Antarctica was only first discovered by Russian ships in 1882. That wasn't much. That was only a couple of decades before this happened. So nobody really knew much about it. And as we go through this and all the problems they had, but they did have the hindsight of a couple of expeditions that had already been there. So they knew more than Scott knew. And the Scott expedition a few years before that was a complete mess. They had absolutely no idea what they were getting into. And then he came back again trying to get to the South Pole and died. And this is like the third expedition in this. So, Shackleton did have the hindsight and a little more knowledge than previous expeditions, but it is the harshest place in the world. It is horrible. And, I would imagine if me and you were around, 100 years ago and you were like, hey, let's go to the Antarctic. I'd be like, no, I'm not going there.
Yeah, too cold.
Let's go to the Amazon, another harsh environment. But there's nothing worse than this place. It's just ridiculously cold, high winds, horrible environment to stay. And it wasn't like they stayed for months. They stayed for years. And you were talking about individual stories. Like in this, we're going to breeze through it and say they moved from here to here. In that movement of 6 or 8 months in some cases, there's a whole book in that movement itself and a whole lot of lessons learned and hardship. And it's just an incredible story.
Let's talk a little bit in framing it about Ernest Shackleton himself. I mean, Ernest Shackleton was born in Ireland, but his family moved to Britain after, I think at the age of 10 for him, but soon after. His dad was a pretty famous physician. He was well known, and he wasn't a poor guy. I mean, this guy grew up in a distinguished and well-known family, not necessarily a silver spoon. He wasn't wealthy, but they weren't hurting. And then he moved to Britain, and at a very early age was interested in this kind of exploration. I think he joined the merchant Marines at the age of 16, and then served almost or over a decade on the water. So he had good experience. So let's talk a little bit about his first expedition that took place with Robert Falcon Scott.
Yeah, he born in Ireland, but Anglo-Irish, so pretty much British, Protestant, born in Ireland, then moved. So him and Tom Crane, completely different class system right there. But went into the Merchant Navy, and was a very experienced sailor and a very experienced navigator. He went on the first Scott expedition, which was mostly military people, mostly Royal Navy, and with some civilians. He didn't agree with Scott a lot. He butted heads with Scott. And at some point during the expedition, he got sick, and Scott sent him home early, which pissed him off. He really wanted to stay, and he really wanted to be part of it. So that really did piss him off. And I think in reading or diving into both expeditions, it seems like he learned a lot of lessons from what not to do. Because, we've said it before in leadership, you learn as much from bad leaders as you do from good leaders, right? So he learned a lot of the lessons, and you can see that he made mistakes. all leaders make mistakes, right? But there was a lot of things he didn't do that Scott did that probably resulted in his people all coming home, which when you look at what happened on this expedition and how much they had to move and how much hardship and they all lived is an incredible story. Like an example would be, like Scott was very, very much into that class system that I talked about, where like on the ship, all the enlisted men were crammed into quarters with bunks that hung like 6 inches, above each other, and in some cases they did hotbed system where if you're on duty, somebody else was sleeping in your bed, whereas all the officers had their own rooms, which is freaking ridiculous, right? But it does still happen to this day. But at one point on the Scott expedition, Tom Crean was actually with them. I think there was 6 of them. They were out and they got stranded. They went into a snow cave, and I think there was like 2 or 3 officers and maybe 4 enlisted guys. They went into this cave and they spent, a couple of days in the cave. But the cave was, it wasn't very deep and it was full of snow. They drew a line in the snow where officers were on one side and enlisted were on the other. It was so ingrained in them, they couldn't break from that. Scott had people he had the enlisted in the Antarctic scrubbing the deck with water, and they'd throw water down, it would freeze immediately. Wow. And they'd have to scrape it all up because that was like the Navy way, and he couldn't break from that. And there's not a lot of references to Shackleton doing stupid stuff like that just for the sake of Navy tradition. There were people who disagreed with some of the calls that Shackleton made, and we can talk about it later on, but leaving food behind and stuff like that. But it's tough to be the leader, man. Heavy is the crown. You got to make all these decisions, and all these people are relying on you and ready to criticize you at a moment's notice if you make the wrong call. So I think overall he was a great leader. He had a great intuition about people, and he treated people well. And I really do think he learned a lot from those first 2 expeditions with Scott.
Yeah, his second expedition he went on by himself and got closer to the South Pole than he did with Scott, which is interesting to me. Kind of his execution of learning lessons and immediately executing his own way. But he made a pretty significant decision to return and exfil without being successful because he wanted to be the first to go to the South Pole because at this point nobody had. And so his decision to basically turn his guys around saved their lives.
I think he was within a couple of 100 miles or something.
Yeah, it was like 112 miles or something like that, which is super close.
Especially when you think of the expanse. Yeah. We have a slide on that, the expanse of the Antarctic. To get that close was just incredible.
Well, let's show that. I think like when you showed me this, even after reading and doing all the research that I did, it's so significant.
It's mind-boggling, right? And when I started looking into this, you say, how come it took them so long? Well, obviously, they're on ice in the harshest place in the world. But if you look at, that's the Antarctica right there. It's a massive continent, and it's absolutely huge. And this is a mountain range here. And you think about like the South Pole is in around here. They landed here in the Weddell Sea. This was all frozen, and then this is where they got stuck. But even when you get on land, that's a massive amount of distance. If you look at, that's the U.S. superimposed on top of the Antarctic, right? So now it kind of makes more sense, right? You come in here to Weddell Sea, you're trying to make it down to here, which is across massive states. You can imagine crossing all these states in the U.S. and frozen landscape, heavy wind, minus 50 degrees and even colder. Some of the windiest places in the world, mountain ranges here. It's just the most harshest place you could ever imagine. But this really does put it into perspective of how much distance we're talking about. Like Shackleton, his goal on the expedition we're talking about was to cross the Antarctic, right? And he had a second team to come in here to lay caches of supplies that they were supposed to come all the way across and then pick them up on the other. It didn't work out that way, but that's a massive amount of distance there to try and cover, especially when you're dealing with, like, at least Shackleton was going to use dogs, right? Scott did not believe in using dogs. He had ponies, which were not suited to the environment, and he had some dogs, but he didn't like he had men pushing the sleds, right, with all those supplies, which was insane. And Shackleton did some of that too, but he did have the dogs in place, and he did use dogs more efficiently than Scott.
Yeah, right before this expedition where he tried to do a transcontinental movement across Antarctica, being in the south and the Arctic being in the north, the pole was already discovered.
Yeah.
Right? A Norwegian by the name of Amundsen winded up doing that with sled dogs.
Yes.
And everything I've researched on Amundsen was that it's not even a cool story because it was so easy.
Yeah.
They made it look easy.
Well, he was very focused on getting to the pole. That's the only thing he wanted to do, was get to the South Pole, and he did it. Whereas, like, both Scott and Shackleton made them scientific expeditions where they were checking out, they were doing a bunch of experiments. They were testing the depth of the ice. They were looking at all the all the penguins and seals and stuff there. So they had multiple things going on, whereas the Norwegians were just super focused, laser focused on planting the flag. Yeah.
One thing I was curious about was Amundsen's tactics, and one of the things he did was immerse himself in culture and understood the Inuit and how they adopted to that environment.
Yeah.
So wearing animal skin, using dogs, using sleds.
And it's funny because the Norwegians are no strangers to the cold either.
Yeah.
But he recognized his weakness, and he went to the Inuit tribes and tried to learn, whereas Scott did not do that.
Yeah.
Scott went in, and on that first Scott expedition, it was shocking how little they knew about this environment. Like, it really was.
The only thing I didn't like about Amundsen is when he reached the South Pole, he ended up killing like 24 of his dogs, two sled runs of his dogs, and feeding them to the men and feeding them to the dogs that were going to do the return trip. Guys on his party hated him for that, but they thought, and more likely true, that was all deliberately planned.
Yeah.
He had a plan of attack, which was to feed themselves along the way using their own dogs to feed.
Yeah.
And then he had caches that were planted and had an enormous amount of weight that he was able to carry through that allowed them to be easily successful in exfil. And ironically enough, reached the South Pole 5 weeks, 31 days exactly before Robert Scott arrived with his party, which we know how that story kind of works out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you know what kind of dogs that Amundsen had? I know.
So Amundsen had, he actually had mostly huskies.
Okay, yeah, because Shackleton had these Canadian
mixed dogs,
right? Yeah.
And some of them were a mix of huskies, but there's arguments about he had the wrong dogs.
Right.
They were problematic.
Yeah.
But Robert Scott, at the detriment to his own decision making, reaches the South Pole, now realizes, because they didn't realize it before, it's not like you can get an email on the ice, that he had been beaten because he saw the Norwegian flag planted.
Mm-hmm.
And
as Scott prepped for this, and it was all publicity and fundraising, and it was a big, massive publicity campaign because he was trying to get money. Amundsen, is that his name? Mm-hmm. He did it really quietly and kept it super low key because he didn't want them to know that he was heading for it too, because he didn't want them speeding up and basing off his timeline. When they left the port in Norway, his crew didn't even know where they were going. They thought they were going north, the Arctic.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So super laser focused guy on achieving the mission.
He looks that way. If you look at pictures of Amundsen and his Inuit family, he truly was living the Indage life. He was pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
I mean,
but
the polar exploration of Scott's last journey ended there because on exfil, him and the men he was with never made it home, never made it back. They actually died on exfil. Later recovered a year later with really good journals and information and scientific data, but again to the detriment of his own life. So Ernest Shackleton sees this and he's like, "What can I do?" Well, the only thing left really is the continental or intercontinental movement across, in this case, northwest to southeast, from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea.
Mm-hmm. The Ross Sea is here.
Yep.
And this is the Weddell Sea right here. And remember, there's a huge mountain range here. I think that's it right there.
Is it the Rocky Mountains?
It
looked like the Rockies when you had it.
Right there.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Like I was interested to learn more about Antarctica, not realizing the extent of how impactful a piece of terrain this is.
Yeah.
We're talking about a place that used to be forest, right? And now is covered in a landmass of rock, ice, mountains, crevasses, all kinds of crazy stuff. Even people conspiracizing hidden civilizations, which Shackleton, or not Shackleton, but Scott found fossilized trees that he had in his possession when they recovered his body. So brutal terrain. This isn't like an open, flat area. This is just the contrary. I mean, it's pretty brutal. And he plans to do it with dogs. That was his plan.
And then, something like when they came in here to the Wattle Sea, they came from South America. Right?
Yeah.
Yep. And then when they came in this side to the Ross Sea, they came from New Zealand. So when you get in here, you have to time it perfectly. When you get in, then you're getting frozen in place. Basically, your ship is getting, unless you drop people off and pull back out, you're getting frozen in place, and the ice can get up to a mile deep in here. Wow. When it freezes, which is insane. You can already wrap your head around that, But once like the ship gets in, and this happened a lot, you'd be frozen in place until it thawed. And Scott got frozen on his first expedition, and they used dynamite to break free to get out, or they would have spent another winter. But they'd come in, they'd build a facility, like a hut basically, and they'd stay a massive amount of stores. They would bring equipment and provisions with them, and they'd know they're going to be there for a couple of years.
You have some interesting statistics on Antarctica. Let's talk about some of that stuff, which is I didn't even realize that there was a possibility for this existing, but how deep
the snow
or the ice is. And then I was super insane. Like some of the coldest recorded temperatures in history are on here.
So you see it, the coldest place on Earth. The annual average temperature is minus 58 degrees, which I remember reading stories about Stalingrad and German soldiers like freezing in place and being found the next day. And it was like minus 50 or minus 40. The lowest temperature ever recorded was minus 128 degrees, which is in 1980, and I tapped that up, in 1983. It was first sighted in 1820, okay? That was the first time it was ever seen. So this is like 100 years before this expedition.
Sealers and whalers more likely because that's
Russian vessels saw it, right? It's the only continent without reptiles because they're smart. There's nobody owns Antarctica. There's no countries in Antarctica. It's a research facility agreed by 48 different countries that it's just going to be used for research. When I was looking at this, there was one part that said that the biggest town in Antarctica was like McMurdo Bay down the south, and it's a research facility with like 10 scientists or whatever. 98% of Antarctica is covered by the Antarctic ice shelf, and which can be up to a mile thick. The continent has about 90% of the world's ice and about 70% of the world's fresh water, which is insane. There are no polar bears on the Antarctic. They're in the Arctic. But they do have like leopard seals, which are predators, and they will eat you. Like they're scary freaking things. And then penguins. So they ate a lot of seals and they ate a lot of penguins when they were out there. But really interesting place.
All right, so moving on to the ship. I mean, at this time, everybody had ships because that was the main way to make sure that you were successful in your expedition. If you didn't have the right boat, then you weren't going to get to the continent, period, because of this pack ice, because of the terrain. And I thought it was real cool because I looked at Amundsen's boat, and it's known as being one of the toughest boats ever made, called the Fram. And this boat, Ernest Shackleton specifically had designed or built out. It was already designed, already built, but he had it built out internally for the expedition for this specific requirement, including getting custom kennels put in, all kinds of stuff. But goes and shops this ship called the Polaris and decides that this is the right one. He finds it in Norway, which was typical of the builders there. They were the best seafaring boats in the world. And then decides he wants to purchase it. I think he paid 10,000 pounds around that, which is over $1 million today. And then they shipped it from Norway to London, where they outfitted the rest of it, had to outfit it custom. But this boat, somebody's going to be insulted by that.
Ship.
It is a ship. This ship was designed to take wealthy people on polar expeditions to hunt polar bear, to do things that rich people do, which is often weird stuff.
Yeah.
But it was built that way, so it had things like an upgraded, what is it, gallows? That's the right word, right? Gallows?
The chow hall?
Yeah, the chow hall. Like
Galley.
Galley.
Galley, yeah.
Like custom galley, fine dining room, all these amenities that Shackleton didn't need. So he outfitted it, set it up for hosting and holding his men and the provisions, and then got ready. Something interesting that we had discussed was the fact that the Fram had a bowl bottom that was used to in order for it to be squeezed out of the ice, the pack ice, so it wouldn't crush it.
Mm-hmm.
But the Endurance, which was renaming it, Shackleton renamed it after his family motto of "Through endurance we conquer." He didn't have that kind of shit.
Yeah, which is weird, huh?
Yeah.
Because he paid dearly for that, right?
Yeah.
Because as the ice crushed the boat, the Fram had the ability to almost deflect the ice, right? Because of the way the hull was shaped, whereas the Endurance didn't. And as the ice started crushing it, it just tore the boat.
It wedged it in place.
Yeah, wedged it in place and tore it to pieces. Yeah.
At the time, he had a 350 horsepower steam engine that was coal powered or coal fueled. The estimate is about 11.4 miles per hour or 12 miles per hour. That wasn't enough. I mean, three main masts was able to navigate the seas, but this ultimately would lead to some issues they faced in the near future.
Yeah, I can imagine how much coal you need to load up to get that kind of a journey.
It's a crap ton
of
coal.
Of weight. Oh my God, yeah.
Some of the interesting things that have taken place in this story, in this expedition, was the fact that he recruited his guys.
Mm-hmm.
Before we go into recruitment, actually, let's talk about the recruitment aspect of it.
Yeah, so this ad is disputed. Obviously, he put an ad somewhere, but a lot of people think this is fake right here. But generally, there's been like McNish, the carpenter. I saw a documentary where his grandson or great grandson or whatever said, "Oh, he saw this ad that said men wanted, harsh climate. You might not return, but you'll have glory if you return." And like, I think thousands of people applied.
And Shackleton's own book, South, that he wrote in 1919, he literally said 5,000 people applied verbatim.
Yeah.
I think the controversy is the specific verbiage and place that the ad was put in.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think why would 5,000 people apply for something like this? Do you think maybe they didn't know what they were getting into?
I think just like we joined the military, young men, 3 women actually applied as well. They wanted an adventure. They wanted to live something great. And at the time, there wasn't a lot going on.
It wasn't, yeah.
I mean, colonizing the world is a great adventure.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a lot happening where they had to go into conflicts. And this seemed like a damn good adventure.
Yeah, true. And then, of course, you're gone for 2 years, 3 years, and you get all that pay when you come back, because it all just builds up, right?
Yeah, tons of benefits. Drinking rum, hanging out with the boys.
I know, right?
Instead of getting, all the other things.
Life
the black
was harsh.
plague.
Yeah, life was harsh back then.
Yeah.
But, sense of adventure, people wanted to go, and he picked a pretty good crew. How many were total? 27?
Well, he took 26 total, not including himself. But the plan was to fill all these positions. He had several positions. He had to fill a couple boats' crews worth. We mentioned the Endurance, but the other boat that was in the south, which was the Ross Sea Party, they also had to fill their boat. Now, they operated very decentralized. That's why it's not often talked about in the story of his expedition, because it was a separate thing.
Yeah.
But that was as impactful in different ways, in tragedy and loss, but also in survival. But he chose 26 guys to fill positions like meteorologists, scientists, physicians, even carpenters and laborers. And the interesting correlation for people in a modern sense, for example, the Harvard Business School looks at the ways in which you're recruited as a good way to recruit your team, which I think is interesting, because I don't think the way in which you're recruited, as it's historically known, is really good. I mean, he used a lot of intuition.
Yep.
He never spent more than 5 minutes interviewing anybody. And often he asked them very different questions that you would hear in an interview. Like, hey, do you have varicose veins? Do you have good teeth? Can you sing? Those are some of the examples, which we all be screwed because we have all the bad things and we can't sing.
Yeah.
I think it's super interesting because he did choose the right people because the proof is in the experience and then the survival.
There were some problem people in there that he denied the polar medal to. We can talk about that later on in the end. But the carpenter McNish was one who at one point, like when Shackleton wrote his book South, he glanced over a lot of he didn't talk about a lot of these things, but other people in their journals wrote, like at one point when they were I think when we were moving to Camp Patience from the ship, and we talk about that later on, like McNish just refused to move. He sat down and said, I'm done, I'm not doing it, and obviously he had nowhere to go, right? I mean, where are you going to go?
Yeah.
And he got him moving, but in the end, he denied him the polar medal because of that incident, even though McNish retrofitted the ships and made the crampons and all that kind of thing we'll talk about. And Shackleton himself said that they wouldn't have made it only for McNish, but he still denied him the polar medal,
which is a big deal back then.
Yeah, it's a little petty, but there's a movement right now trying to still get McNish.
Yeah.
There's a statue of McNish with the cat in New Zealand.
Yeah.
But he obviously picked the right people. And you talk about McNish that he complained but he was in harsh conditions. Like at points they're eating like a biscuit and 3 sugar cubes a day, like doing manual labor, like pushing sleds across the worst place in the world. So
seems kind of petty for him to judge.
It kind of does,
guys,
right?
Yeah.
It kind of does, yeah. But
So he chooses 26 guys. They lose some guys, they gain some guys, but they did have a stowaway named Blackborough. It was an 18-year-old they picked up, leaving out of the port of. They actually picked him up out of Buenos Aires. They lost some guys and then gained some guys. They didn't realize he was on, but he was a stowaway. And this 18-year-old Blackborough, who plays some significant roles, but also loses some toes on one of his feet. He plays a part in this, but he wasn't planned for the expedition. So they depart with a total of 28 men, including Shackleton, for the final departure of South Georgia into Antarctica. So let's talk about some of the timeline. You want to walk them through? That's a good slide to talk through.
Yeah, so they go from England all the way down to Buenos Aires. Then they go from there to South Georgia, right here. And then they go from South Georgia into the Weddell Sea right here. And this is where they got stuck, right? And I mean, we come back to this slide, but they got stuck in pack ice. And pack ice is, it's like, look at that. Imagine trying to cut your way through ice. That's like, I think the deepest ice is a mile deep, but it's probably at least a couple of 100 meters deep, the ice right there. And like I said, they had no explosives, which I found weird because Scott had used explosives successfully to break out of the ice just a couple of years before, but they had no, like, they're cutting it with saws and picks and shovels, trying to break it out of the pack ice, which is extremely serious. But at this point, they come down, they go from South Georgia, they retrofit, they come in here to the Weddell Sea, and now this is all frozen, and they're locked in the ice. For, I can't remember, what was the timeline they were locked in the ice?
9 months.
9 months.
Yeah. So when they leave, I mean, when they left the whaling station of South Georgia, which is a very, at this point, full of experienced seamen who have traveled this area, they know everything about the terrain. Yeah. What's smart, I thought, of Shackleton is spending 30 days on the ground. He didn't have to.
But he didn't listen to them. They told him the pack ice is worse this year than it's ever
further
been.
north than it's ever been in history.
Yeah, and he was judged for that. A couple of bad decisions he made are hindsight being 2020 was one. Leaving the food behind, and a few times he did that. There were the other decisions that he made that were questionable, right? Mm-hmm. But it would be hard to do all this. It took years to raise the funds for this, to get down here, get all the way here and go, okay, we're not going to proceed we're going to wait till next year.
Wait another season.
Because, Billy Bob over here told me the pack ice is really bad this year.
Yeah. The tactic is in the southern hemisphere, obviously it's a reverse of what we experienced in the northern hemisphere in North America. But the tactic was just to wait it out. And he didn't have the patience to wait.
No, he didn't.
Really quickly, when he departed South Georgia, which was months after he left London, by the way, when he decides 2 days later in open ocean, he starts running into pack ice. And it's recorded in people's journals like, whoa, this isn't normal, but let's continue. So as they continue, they're navigating, like in that picture of the pack ice, they're navigating these blocks of ice.
In between, they're skirting in between, and then they're ramming some of the blocks because the bow of the ship is like a couple of feet thick, like specifically designed to ram through this ice.
Yeah, the sides have like recorded Norwegian fir. It's like 30 inches of wood. Yeah, and they use different types of wood. That's the strongest wood ever made. I mean, compared to steel. And so the fact that they're getting locked in is problematic.
Yeah.
As they travel further south, there's a point in which they get completely locked in.
Yeah.
And what you have to understand about this pack ice is we're talking about ice cubes on top of water. So fresh water that's floating on top of ocean water that's moving. So not only are they getting locked into the ice and contained, but they are moving with that pack ice off their trajectory. That's why there's other different positions, because they realize after they're using their sextants, their chronometers, their prosthetic compasses, they're realizing they're not only off course, but they're being pushed further out to sea and getting into more pack ice and more issues.
Yeah, well, they're going the wrong direction.
Wrong direction completely.
Yeah.
So, he gets to this point where he's locked in this ice, and the men basically assume an annual bed down location where they're going to have to wait until the next season.
Yeah.
And so they live off this boat. And I think there's a lot of cool lessons learned, but a couple of them are that Shackleton, to keep his men's morale high. You had mentioned it before, but the provisions that they took were so extreme. They had planned for years of being
life was pretty good on the ship at this point.
Yeah.
I mean,
rum, biscuits, jams, jellies, honey.
Musical instruments,
dudes
music.
with wigs.
They played cards. They had games. They kept their mind active. And everybody had jobs to do, right? And he kept them without doing BS jobs, right? Like busy work. He kept them active, and he kept morale pretty high. And this was something that I think they expected, right? They expected to get locked in with the ice and to be there a couple of years. So life was pretty good at this point.
I think it's super interesting when you look at the individual behavior of Shackleton, when he notes times in which morale was low, like it was a living thing. And then when morale was low, he would do things like have activities.
Yeah.
He would have music. One of the guys had a banjo, and they played music together. They would have skits.
He was aware of it.
Yeah.
Right? He was cognitive of morale, and he monitored it at all times.
He thrived also in routine. He made the guys on average do about 3 hours of work a day, which kept their minds busy. One of the really impactful things that I think saved these guys' lives was the work that they had to do with the dogs.
Yeah.
I can't remember the circumstances. It had to do with kind of emergency leave kind of thing. They had a dog trainer on staff, but he fell off.
Yep.
And now when they showed up, they didn't have anybody. So these guys like Frank Wild, Worsley, the main characters in this, were given the responsibility of working the dogs, which took a team effort. So you had 69 dogs when they infilled, when they set sail from London. And I think when they actually got to the point where they're locked in ice, they're around 54 dogs.
Yeah.
But these dogs were Canadian bred dogs that were husky mixes that had been noted as being problematic in a lot of instances, but also helped their morale because they had to train them.
Yeah.
And they loved them.
And they got super attached to them.
Which
we'll talk about later on. But these dogs were, without a proper trainer, they would pull the weight, but if the sleds got too close to each other, the dogs would attack the other dogs like they were rivals and stuff like that. And how close they got to those dogs, and it was crazy, right? I mean, it was one of the things that plummeted morale later on when we get there. But Yeah.
So
go ahead.
So there's a timeline that we have, and we'll show some of the outline of the timeline. Some of it's hard to read, but we just want to give you some of the chronological order of things. Once they get locked into sea, there comes a point at the end of the 9 months where the ship is getting crushed by the ice.
Yeah.
And they realize that because of this crushing of the ship, the sounds they're hearing, they can't sustain life on the boat. Now, this is like a month-long train wreck. Right?
Yeah.
They see it coming. They experience it every single day, and they know at some point they're going to have to abandon ship. Well, that point comes. And what they do is they have 3 life vessels. These are lifeboats, not ships. These are rowboats.
You can actually see it on this here. The lifeboats on the side.
Yeah.
You actually see them. They're really small.
Yeah, they're 21-foot boats.
Yeah.
They do have mast, like a single mast and a single sail, but they're rowboats.
Yeah. Yep.
And then they excavate these off the ship. They pull as many supplies as they can because they know it's coming. There's actually good video of this. Frank Hurley, who was the photographer / videographer, who, by the way, was hired because of promises made in funding that they were going to have all this documentation, all this video. They sold the rights to this video as part of this. He had good video of them disembarking the actual ship. They have a tarp in one case where they're throwing the dogs overboard, and they're abandoning the ship, literally abandoning it.
Yeah, I was looking for the video. I had it there. It's on YouTube where they have the tarp and they're dropping the dogs down, sliding down, and then it was a little later on, but they showed the ship actually getting crushed.
Yeah,
getting destroyed, which had to be devastating. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was at the start of the winter where it's dark for 4 months straight, right? It must have been a blow. Like, it must have been a serious blow.
Yeah, that throughout history, the sun going away forever in a this low light twilight has been demoralizing to many expeditions prior of making people crazy. I mean, there's you obviously get a lot of vitamin D from the sun, and the deficiency in that can drive you literally insane.
Yeah.
The lack of melatonin,
they call it
messes up sleep.
seasonal affective disorder up in like Scandinavia and places like that.
Well, we had it. Remember, we had it in reverse cycle.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
We were pale and depressed.
Oh yeah, we were doing night operations for months and months and months, sleeping during the day and going out at night, and it does take effect on you. And that was only a couple of months.
They said the morale of those guys during this was relatively good.
Yeah.
But when they lost the ship, things started to deteriorate.
Yeah.
I mean, they pull the ships off, and then they get to a point where they realize they have to live and function. They create igloos for the dogs. They continue to train them, which was, again, a lifesaver. And at some point, Shackleton decides that they're going to move and try to make movement across the ice shelf, which I have to think is a super bold decision. You're moving across packed ice, trying to get to land.
Yeah.
They had a direction and distance. Obviously, they had the guesstimates on navigation, but to abandon everything they had and continue forward with the little they took.
Yeah, and they left. So this is how they were moving. They were moving with sleds and dogs. They were walking and they were dragging these boats with them, which they were on runners here that were designed to go across. But it was so cold that the runners were freezing and they had to chip away at them to get them to move again. And when he made this movement, he left a lot of supplies and food behind him.
Tons of it.
Which again, he was because he thought he was going to get rescued. He thought he was going to find land, and he thought he was a very optimistic guy, right? I mean, you'll see it in the journals a lot where people were like, his optimism is hurting us, right? Because he always thought, oh no, we're going to get there, right? So when he left the ship and took off, they left like thousands of pounds of food. They're like tinned meat.
Killed a lot of dogs too.
Yeah.
That was the first round of really the decision to off the dogs because
which hammered morale.
It did.
It really hurt morale, and they killed the cat too. Yeah. They killed the cat that Chippy or something. The cat was, and
Mrs. Chippy. And it was a guy. It was a male.
Okay.
cat,
Yeah. Which, I mean, I don't know how much room a cat takes up, but
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder why to kill it. It probably wouldn't have survived the harsh environment and the movement. I mean, the dogs are just more rugged and stronger and built for that environment.
There's even one account of them having to kill the puppies.
Yeah.
And one specifically, one of the guys was super attached to that dog, and he had to dispatch it. And there's an account in a journal of him walking away, sitting down by himself with a dog. And these are puppies. They're loving puppies. And it was nipping at his hand and playing, and then he had to shoot it with his pistol.
Yeah.
And then he shot it and missed. It didn't miss it. He didn't kill it immediately, shot it in his neck, and then he had to manually reload with time and then shot it in his head. Wow. And devastating circumstance, but honestly, probably in the end, again, this hard and tough decisions that leaders have to make probably allowed them or facilitated their survival.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, they wouldn't have been able to survive with those dogs at all anyway.
Yeah.
He was criticized because he made these decisions very early on, but maybe there's some hindsight that he understood or saw because of his experiences at sea.
Exactly. And he was a very intelligent guy, right? So it's very easy to look 100 years later in hindsight and say, why did he do this? And with the benefit of all the knowledge we have right now, and we know so much more about that area of the world now than he did. So decisions made at the time were the best decisions he could have made. He didn't make them lightly, I'm sure. And I mean, again, it's hard to be the leader, man. It's hard to make all these decisions when people are relying on you.
He gets to Camp Patience, which was namely mainly named by the guys. I'm assuming it might have been facetious or a little sarcastic, because they had to have the patience. And the crazy thing is they spent days and then up to a week navigating and suffering only to be in eye shot of the actual ship because of the way things were moving.
Yeah, if we go back to the map, not that one. Yeah, they're still on ice. Like, they're not even on land right now. They're on frozen water. And as they're walking and moving, the ice is also moving and rotating. So they walked and walked and walked for days and days and days. And then they look back and they could still see the ship. The ship had not actually destroyed right now at this point, right? But and I think at that point he made the decision, we're just going to stop, set up camp, and let the ice move us towards where we're going, right? And I think at that point he sent people back for more food, right?
He did.
Yeah.
Individuals that went back, which is so crazy to think about. Let's just hey, can a couple guys just run back and get some stuff?
Yeah.
He didn't want to move the crew. At this point, a lot of guys were hurting. I mean, they were starving.
Yeah.
There was a lot of instances of where they didn't think they were going to make it.
Yep.
And at this point, the leopard seal comes into play because they are literally starving to death.
Yep.
And they had at this point dispatched all the animals. They even ate the second round of dogs. And
there weren't many seals to be eaten.
There
right?
At this point, there wasn't.
I'm sure a marine biologist knows why, but there was no seals around, right? So at one point, one of the guys was out. This freaking thing attacks him.
Leopard seal.
That's a leopard seal. That's a predator, right?
Yeah.
And it eats other seals. It eats penguins. It eats all fish. It eats all kinds of stuff. But this thing came at him in the middle of nowhere on the ice and chased him down. And it's kind of clumsy on the ice, but it's super fast underwater. So it dove underneath the ice and then tracked him underneath by his shadow and then came up in front of him and was going to eat him. Apparently, it's got a massive mouthful of teeth that opens up really wide. And as it was about to kill him, Frank Wild took a shot at it with a rifle, missed, and then it turned and attacked Frank Wild, who fired at it 4 or 5 more times and probably hit it a couple of times before he was able to take it down. But 1,000 pounds of meat they had for chow right there. But imagine getting eaten by this thing.
Yeah.
This thing was made for it's top of the food chain right there. It was made for that environment, and it's super vicious and was not afraid of people at all.
Yeah. One of the things they were terrified by was what they deemed the killers. They called them killers. but they're known as orcas or killer
Right.
whales. And at the time, anybody who was on the seas looked at them as devastating threats because of how they hunted their prey. But to this day, there are no recorded in history of human beings, no recorded deaths of people being killed by killer whales or by one of the most intelligent species of whale on the planet.
The part in the Tom Crane book where they're on the Scott expedition, where they're on the different parts of the ice, and he's jumping from ice to try and get back. They were talking about in that they knew it was dangerous because the killer whales will bump the ice and knock penguins into the water so they can eat them. So they were afraid.
Which
that's
is funny, but
they were afraid that's what he was going to do. Right? They're going to do that to him because they see them as penguins, right? They see shadows in the ice, and the same with sharks eat divers because they look like with the wetsuits on, they look like seals, right?
Now, I did say that no recorded cases. That's in the wild. In captivity, there's actually 3 from one whale, which
from Disney.
From Marineland and SeaWorld.
Yeah.
If you're interested in seeing that story, it's been made into a documentary called Blackfin. But the point is they didn't have a lot of understanding of anything at this point, and everything was a danger. The camp literally comes unglued.
Yeah,
like you said, Tom Crane at one point jumps across a crevice. He saves his guys. There's one account of Shackleton literally pulling one of the guys out of his in his sleeping bag out of the water, the ocean that he fell into.
So the ice is coming apart now because the temperature's rising and the ice is coming apart. So they're trying to find that delicate balance between not launching the boats too early, where the ice has just crushed the boat in minutes, but not waiting too long that they all drowned, right? They're trying to find that balance on when to go into the water. There did be a sleep at night, and the ice would crack right down the middle and break into 2 sections, which is crazy.
It's scary.
Yeah.
If you're on the section that doesn't have a boat, you're dead.
Yeah,
you're gone.
Exactly, yeah.
So at one point, and I think it was the point where Shackleton had ripped one of the guys out of the water, saved his life. Shackleton decides they need to drop the boats in water. There's an account of them seeing the open ocean at a section, and they think they can make it.
Yeah.
Because the idea is if they can make it to open ocean, then they could head and navigate towards Elephant Island.
Right. I think that's here, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so Elephant Island was a big mass of land that was physical land within eyeshot. I think it's 40-plus miles wide. It was a target they could hit, but nobody had really been to Elephant Island at this point. And it's extreme because you should understand that they're navigating with a sextant, a compass, and a chronometer, and they're doing so day and night. And they do this for 5.5 days.
Yeah.
Into
the roughest seas in the world.
The roughest seas in the world.
Small boats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They finally make a visual on Elephant Island. And look, Elephant Island, the word island provokes all this comfort, but there's nothing comfortable about Elephant Island.
It's a rock.
It's a jagged, cold, frigid rock full of wind, sleet, snow, rain. It's devastating there, and they're making landfall. They're looking for a means to make landfall. I think it's a real cool segment in the story is at this time, Blackburrow has bad frostbite on one of his feet. They had already decided that they were going to one of the physicians is going to surgically remove his toes. They do that. He's in a whole bunch of pain, and they decide, Shackleton decides because of the morale of the element, that Blackburrow, the 18-year-old, now 19-year-old a year later, is going to be the first to put his feet on the land, the physical land. Because nobody up until this point, at least not documented in history, has been to Elephant Island. There's actually some accounts of sealers and whalers making landfall on both Elephant Island and Antarctica, but they didn't want to give their secrets away because they're whalers and sealers. They have their little hunting spots.
Yeah.
So he picks him up and puts him on the land, and he collapses because he can't hold his weight on his own feet. And then guys jump out to assist him to make sure he is the first to touch land. But it wasn't like a party, because once they make landfall, it's like,
they're like, now what?
now we got a new set of problems, right?
Yeah.
The big benefit for them is they actually had a sustainable resource for not only fresh water, which they were surrounded by, but was also food.
Yeah.
Because they had penguins.
Right. And up until this point, from Camp Patience, from the last part of Camp Patience, they couldn't even cook food because they had no seals, and they were using seal blubber to fuel the stoves, right? So I assume now when they got back here that they could use the cooker again, because they could kill seals and take the seal blubber and start cooking hot food again, which must have been a huge morale booster.
Yeah, they talk about their first hot meal on the island. And in one case, in one day, they killed up to 60-something penguins. And these are like seriously endangered penguins now, emperor penguins. That had never seen men before.
Yeah.
So these dudes are just walking up to them like, hey, what's going on, buddy? And then clubbing them to death.
Yeah.
But it truly is what sustained their survivability on this island. But they still had a set of problems, which was, how are they going to get from this place to other land, which in this case was the closest land was South Georgia. I mean, South Georgia, again, is an island.
Yeah.
You miss South Georgia, and the only thing you got is Australia, right? That's Australia on there. Or I'm sorry, not Australia, South Africa. That's
over here.
Yeah, you miss South Georgia.
Way.
You got like 3,000 miles to South Africa, and you're likely not to hit that. So
I think that's the Falklands right there, right?
Yeah. So they're in this predicament, and they know nobody's coming for them.
Yeah.
And Shackleton has to make another tough decision, which is he needs to get to South Georgia, to the whaling station. They literally left before, but a year and some change before.
Yeah. So they have 3 boats. So they cannibalize 2 of them and retrofit one, and they put like a roof on it, basically, so they have somewhere to get in out of the elements. And this is where the McNish, the carpenter, really came in handy, right? Because he was the guy that cannibalized the boats, and he came up with innovative ways to mix, like, I think seal blood and flour and something else, and seal the boats so they wouldn't sink. And then he came up with a way to take like wood screws and screw them into the boots to make crampons, which later on saved some lives. But he had been a problem up to this point, but now he really came into his own, right? So and because he'd been a problem, Shackleton decided to take him on the one boat. So Shackleton and I think, how many guys? 4 guys? 4 other guys. They retrofitted this one boat. They fitted it, and they tried to make it to South Georgia, where everybody else stayed on Elephant Island, which must have been, harrowing, because they know that if Shackleton's boat doesn't make it, they all die. Because there was nobody looking for them. Yeah. There was no rescue team. You were on your own. Yeah,
he left Frank Wild in charge of the men behind, which was a tough decision for him, because Wild was his 2IC.
Yeah.
And, Tom Crean was with him, thank goodness.
Yeah.
But he had taken the problem children with him as well, because he didn't want to destroy the morale.
Which is, again, good leadership decision, because it would have been super easy just to pick 4 rock stars and you're all you know what I mean? Where he did take some problem children, and he took that burden on himself rather than leaving it behind, because he knew it would be a huge problem for the guys staying back.
I think it's really cool when the small details, like one of the guys took a temperature reading of the inside of that boat after they outfitted and insulated it, and it was 84 degrees inside of there.
Really?
Which made them sweat profusely if they had too much on. And what they said, it was like every time they went in, they would sweat, and it was just insanely disgusting.
Yeah.
But at this case, when you're in the field even for a short period of time, you just don't care, right? And these guys, they were having to melt their snow, essentially, in their little tin cans to get enough water to keep them hydrated.
Yeah.
And one block, they said, in their tin cups would only accumulate a couple sips of fresh water. And that was a constant battle, because they were constantly sweating inside of these things.
I imagine they were suffering from scurvy at this point too, because you can't just eat meat, and you can't just eat like biscuits and sugar, and the rations were running out. So scurvy is the lack of vitamin C, where you don't get fresh fruit and stuff like that, and your teeth start rotting, your skin gets all jacked up. And I think they were suffering from scurvy, some of them right now at this point, right?
Yeah, some of them were. And, you can get vitamin C from organ meat from animals, which is really dense in it, but there was only so much organ meat to go around. And again, you're eating penguins every single day as every meal.
Yeah.
They had this sludge of food that they added water. They didn't have many rations, and so there was no delicacies.
Yeah.
It's the same crap.
Yeah,
And,
every day. Yeah.
Every single day.
It's funny, when they killed that leopard seal and they cut it open, it had dozens of undigested fish in its belly.
And they loved it.
And they loved it. They were
Yeah.
like, oh, nice. Yeah.
It was cool because I, not to compare Ranger School with the Shackleton Expedition, but
Ranger school was harder.
yeah, when you starve, the only thing you think about is food.
Yeah, yeah.
And these guys would tell stories to each other about
Yeah,
food.
yeah.
And they would make lists. I remember doing the same thing in
Yeah,
Ranger School where
yeah.
I'd look at my buddy and I'd say, well, what else are you going to add to your grocery list? Like Cocoa Pebbles, and then when you get back, you're so nauseous of food
Yeah,
because
yeah.
your body can't handle it. You don't even want to touch food.
Yeah.
I never saw a Cocoa
I
Pebble.
thought it was funny, too, that in Camp Patience, when there was all about food, there was one guy there who was kind of chubby. And they were like, "Man, we're gonna eat you first." Like,
Yeah,
like
part
the
of that was
jokes-
probably real.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't come to that, but they were close. They
Yeah.
were close to cannibalism.
Yeah,
They
there's many
were.
expeditions, which we'll talk about.
Would you
a
eat?
couple
Would you eat somebody, a person?
with a fat ass? Yeah.
Would you?
Oh yeah, dude. I
Tear
don't
that
care.
shit up?
Dude, I would eat the hell out
I
of a
would
person.
too.
I would
tear
too.
that shit up, man.
I would eat it up,
A
especially a
little
guy I didn't like.
Tabasco
Where's the
sauce?
guy I don't like? I'm gonna eat you up.
I like George, but George would be first to go.
Dude.
A lot of meat in those bones.
Tons of
man.
meat. His head,
Yeah?
he's got a lot of fat head, like boar cheese. It's like boar head cheese. He's got like a fat head cheese.
A little Tabasco sauce, man. That should be
Ooh, I don't even
good.
need sauce, man. It's even raw. So yeah, Shackleton at this point takes 4 guys himself, and they launch. And I got to imagine at the point in which they launch, and the guys are saying goodbye. And
Yeah.
there's actually a picture of that
There
that Frank
is. I thought I
Hurley
had it.
took.
Yeah.
A lot of people use that in the context of them being rescued, but spoiler alert. But it's actually them departing.
Do you remember what the distance was between?
It was well. I know it took 13 days.
Okay, that's a navigation feat and a half.
It
right
is.
there, man. To be able to hit that, that's crazy. Yeah.
It is. In fact, a lot of seamen hit me up and were like, "Hey, man, that just to let you know the way they navigated with that boat and the fact
Yeah.
they hit that is 1 in a million."
Right, they're using a sextant and
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to measure the horizon or whatever the sextant does, but the boat's going like this and up and down and up and down,
Yeah.
and just
Day and night.
day and night with malnutrition and cold and just insane. Like,
There's one case of Shackleton's recount of being in a storm, a vicious storm, because they were in a vicious storm before they made landfall across this body of water, which is known even today as being one of the roughest parts
Right.
of the ocean, period. It's actually known by many seamen as being one of the roughest parts, where when they crossed this, the waves were 50 foot high, and they identified what he thought was an opening in the clouds of the storm, which happened to be the white caps of the top of a wave, and then that were devastating them.
Yeah.
At one point, they got jostled so hard that all the equipment they had in their hands wasn't in their hands, and they thought they didn't have the equipment, which would have meant instant death for them because they
imagine
would
losing the sextant.
Dude,
right?
no
Done.
means. If Austin was on the trip, we'd be screwed because he'd
I
lose.
know his
3 pieces
accountability of equipment is terrible. Austin, where's the sextant? Oh, I thought you were going to get it.
He's got a piece of seal. He's like, oh, I accidentally brought this instead. So, but they do make it.
Yeah.
13 days into this venture,
Boom.
they make landfall in South Georgia, which people, which when you say they make landfall, and even in the story of that's super inspiring of them making landfall, is really just the beginning of that challenge.
They're on the wrong side.
They're on the wrong
Yeah,
side.
the whaling station is on the opposite side of the island, and obviously they'd rather cross the mountains
Yep.
than try to sail around. And you know the currents and all that probably weren't favorable, but they probably had enough of that boat.
They did.
13
They had 3
days.
ill men. 3 of
Yeah.
the men out of the 5, Tom Crean and Shackleton, were intact and ready to go. They
Yeah.
could make the trip,
Yeah.
but nobody else could, right?
Right. Yeah. So they get on this rock, this frozen rock, and then they split up, right? the healthy men crossed the mountain, which is a mountaineering feat in itself.
It's 30 plus miles.
Yeah.
It was 30 miles across mountains.
When you've been malnourished, fatigue. I mean, I'm sure they didn't sleep on that boat hardly at all, right?
Yeah.
Your body will take over and force you to sleep eventually. But imagine inside that little boat bouncing all over the ocean for 13 days. They must have been in ragged shape.
Yeah.
Did they sit there, kill some penguins, gain their strength, or did they leave pretty much right away?
No, they did. They spent some time on the ground trying to get healthy.
You'd have to.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
Which was smart. I think these tactful decisions of being tactically patient and not outrunning their headlights was one of, I mean, look, what else better do you have to do than sustain your own health and survivability? There was no rush, right?
Yeah.
So they knew if they reset, they could make the trip, and they did just that.
Right.
But it was also brutal in the conditions they had. They slept underneath the boat. They flipped it upside down, and they did the best they could, but they needed to get food. They needed to get some substance. One of the things they were affected by was dehydration.
Yeah.
They didn't have any water on the open water besides the little bit of water they took, which they saw as a mistake. And there's several journal accounts of them being so thirsty and not being able to get fresh water that they were almost drinking seawater that winded up saving them.
It's the whole thing is like the limit of physical endurance
Again
for
and again.
people.
And
again
again.
and again
Yeah.
and again, right? And it's like, it's almost like another day of that, they all would have died, right?
Yeah.
And then they would go here, and then another day of that, they all would have died. Like somebody was looking out for them.
It's crazy.
It is.
One of the things was cool. I thought was interesting was they get to the camp, and they're the first guy they run into at the whaling station doesn't recognize who Shackleton is.
Yeah.
Remember, when Ernest Shackleton was in the camp in the whaling station, he was treated like a celebrity. He had come, everybody knew who he was from history in expeditions, and knew that this was going to be a great adventure. They had put out the full spread for these guys. These guys were treated very well. And they had spent a lot of time, including Shackleton, with the heads of the whaling companies that were present, so much so that they were throwing like parties. They threw a party right before they left as a going away party. And the guy he was talking to knew who he was, but didn't recognize him because he was so tattered, beaten, and just weathered. And in fact, when he realized it was Shackleton in the conversation, he actually turned his head away, and it's noted that he was wept in tears.
Yeah, I can't imagine how much weight he lost, you know?
Yeah.
Probably added years to his life, but he was a glutton for punishment because he kept coming back and doing it again and again.
At this point, we are 18 months into this journey. At this point, 18 months.
Yeah.
So he makes his way into the whaling station, and good old Shackleton doesn't hesitate for a moment. They immediately go back and recover the other three men, and pull them into safety. And
so they go to the other side of South Georgia and pick up the three who were not well enough to cross the mountain. That's the first thing they do. They had no problem getting those guys, right?
They didn't. It was easy. The whaling ships they had and vessels were immediately made the turnaround. I don't think Shackleton was actually on that boat, and the guys wondered why his guys weren't, why Shackleton wasn't on the boat. And the interesting thing is, and I believe this, I might be parastoring here, is one of the guys, I think it might have been Crean. I don't know if was Crean was with them, right?
Crean went across the mountain with them. Yes.
So it was Crean.
You know, when they got to the top of that mountain, I think there was one other guy because they.
Yeah, it was three guys.
Yes, because there was a massive slope down into fog.
They slid together.
They had no idea how far it was. Yeah. They just roped all together and slid down.
They said they laughed at the bottom because they lived. But you're right. Yes, and I apologize for that. But when they recovered the guys, Shackleton didn't go because he was already on another boat, making his way to the guys, and they didn't realize that the guys that they were receiving were those guys because they were clean. They had bathed, and they didn't recognize them. So when they got on a boat, Shackleton gets on his boat. He makes several attempts trying to get in through pack ice on several different types of boats.
To Elephant Island.
to Elephant Island.
So they picked them up in South Georgia, and then they head all the way back to Elephant Island to
Yep.
pick up the other guys. But they can't get in because of the sea, I think, right?
Yeah, the pack ice.
Yeah.
The pack ice was stopping them from coming in,
Yeah.
and they didn't have the right boat. So I believe it's on the third attempt that Shackleton works with the Chilean Navy and gets one of the commanders, which he recognizes personally in the book South that he wrote, that if it weren't for that naval vessel, that naval commander, and the Chilean government, they wouldn't have been able to get in there.
Yeah, and they didn't even know if those guys were still alive.
They didn't.
They probably expected.
This was 4 months later.
Yeah, it was 4 months later. Yeah,
4 months
They probably
later.
thought they're probably not alive, or maybe one or two of them are alive.
Yeah.
And they got in there and they're all alive.
All of them alive.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
basically gets a sit rep from Frank Wild who says they're all in well. That's what
Yeah.
he responded. And they couldn't believe it, man.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the excitement of everybody knowing they're getting on this vessel and their ship. They still had a little bit of a trip to go. They got on this boat and they went immediately to Buenos Aires. And not Argentina. Was it Argentina or Chile? I think they actually went back to Chile.
Probably that's where the boat
did.
came from. Yeah,
It
yeah.
seaported in Chile 3 days later, but they were alive and well,
Yeah.
and all of them survived.
Yeah, which, I mean, it's not a story of exploration because they didn't. That was
They
a
weren't
failure,
successful, yeah.
right? But it's a story of, survival, endurance, resilience, leadership. I mean, there's so many lessons learned from it, and it is really a good case study of being a leader in the worst conditions you could imagine.
So, somebody asked me about, men, they said, why aren't men built this way? And today you have to realize that the luxuries and comfort that we're accustomed to are the benefit from the sacrifices that men like this made.
Yeah.
What's to note is the day they left, August 8th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany.
Yep.
And a lot of people throughout history have accused them of being dodgers of the war. I've actually saw documentation of that before, which is a complete absence and misunderstanding of what actually took place in history. Before they knew war was going to break out, Shackleton went to the government and to Churchill and gave them permission to utilize their vessel and all of their men, including himself, to fight the war. And the government came back and said, we don't need that.
Yep.
And what was the word? The one word?
Proceed. Yeah.
Proceed.
Yep.
And Winston Churchill sent them a letter and saying, thank you for your sacrifice, but you're needed in this venture. We need this expedition. So they did just that. Something super impactful for me in looking at this from a kind of like a veteran perspective of military experience is all of these men came back after the expedition. They literally hit the ground and they immediately turned around and started volunteering for war.
Yeah.
2 of the men died within 2 months of them getting home on the battlefield of World War I. One of them, I believe, in a torpedo strike, and one of them on the battlegrounds fighting this war. 900,000 Brits died in this war. They didn't realize the extent of how this would develop. Went through 22 months, 24 months total, but 22 months on the ice trying to survive, 490-something days, and they come back and they immediately volunteer for war.
I know, and it wasn't like, not to marginalize it, but the people who volunteered at the start of the war had no idea what that war was going to be like. By the time they volunteered, the war was on for 2 years, and they had no illusion about what they were getting into. People were being slaughtered in massive numbers because all armies in it were using old tactics against new weapons, right? Charge over the top and get cut down by machine gun fire, right? Artillery. Weapons had advanced, but tactics had not at that point, and they had no illusion what they were getting into, which is a really a testament to their bravery and their sacrifice.
Yeah, many of them, all of them went back in some capacity. Even Blackborough, who served, who initially got denied because of his toes being amputated, they came back and they served. Some of them died, and many of them grew into their 70s and 80s in life and lived extravagant and what I mean extravagant, in peaceful, amazing lives where they made differences in many ways. Frank Hurley, the photographer, Worsley, all these guys did something of impact in their lives. Tom Crean, who came back. It's interesting.
A pub.
Yeah, he opened a pub. It's interesting about Tom Crean is not many people knew about his ventures.
Again, he second-class citizen, very humble guy. Did not want any recognition in any way. Got the Polar Expedition Medal. Probably got it a couple of times, I think.
Yeah.
But very, very humble guy. Very, very. The book I'm reading right now, Unsung Hero, is a perfect name for it, right? Because nobody really recognized him for what he had done. Other people like Robert Scott and Shackleton get all the credit, but he was a huge piece of that, and he saved a lot of lives multiple times over. Because he was such a, you keep reading about him, and everybody in their journals, the word they keep using to describe him is reliable, right? He was reliable. Oh, we took Crean, or they'll say we took the Irishman because he was reliable. You know what I mean? Like a lot of times in Scott's diary, he didn't even call him by his name. He called him the Irishman. Which was just, it was part of the way things were looked at back then.
I think it's really fitting that these men did their service after the expedition and led these great lives, some of them, again, living into their 70s and 80s. And the BBC in the 60s captured some interviews, and they called Shackleton the boss. That was his nickname. But there's a quote, and I'm going to hack it up because I'm paraphrasing here. But essentially it said, Scott had said this about Shackleton himself, that like when you're down at your worst, pray for Shackleton, right?
Yeah.
Pray for Shackleton. And I think, it's a testament to the person that Shackleton was. One of the things that Shackleton did after his service is he spun things back up. He wrote his book in 1919, meeting his obligation of writing a book as part of the deal. Even though it wasn't successful, he had an obligation, which is a great book, by the way, called South. And then he went on his next expedition in 1921. In 1921, on this expedition, he had a heart attack at the age of 47 years old. And then later, after the initial heart attack, had a second heart attack and winded up passing away. I believe Frank Wilde was at his side when he passed away. And this was somewhere off the coast of South Georgia. And his wife... He had a wife and two kids. Actually, his wife is the one who said, don't transport him back to Britain, bury him in South Georgia. That's essentially what he wanted. There's a lot of controversy in that about his relationship with his wife, who was the daughter of a very wealthy man, and his relationship with his family, because he never mentioned it.
He was chasing something, man. He was chasing, maybe it was glory, maybe it was something deeper, but he was pursuing something that... we'll never know, right? But
reminds me of myself in dark ways.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like I said, 100 years ago, Kevin, let's go to the Antarctic. I'd be like, no. I'm not
well, you just don't know it
Let
yet. We're going to the Antarctica. Wrapping up this conversation in 2000. Well, he wound up passing away in off South Georgia. They buried him in South Georgia, and Frank Wilde requested after he passed away that his ashes be relocated and buried next to Mr. Shackleton in South Georgia, which they're buried underneath a cross today.
Yep.
I think it's an amazing tribute to two wonderful men of many wonderful men who have paved the way in survival, resilience, and all things that are epic, I think, in history of humankind.
Yeah, just the mental resolve and the resilience to keep going after you've just gotten slapped on over and over and over again. It's just incredible. It really is. Having done, hardship at a fraction of what they've done, and being in, cold and wet and hungry and tired and in dangerous environments, but it's a fraction of what that was, and it went on for so long, and the distances were so vast.
The longest ass whipping ever.
Oh my God, yeah. It would be so easy to mentally tap out, but they didn't. They kept going, which is crazy.
In 2000, I believe 17, they tried to recover the Endurance because the ship, the Endurance, has never been recovered. They lost one of their underwater
it moved, right?
Robots,
it crushed into the ice, and it moved because the ice is moving.
Yeah.
So that locating it was probably problematic, right?
Really difficult. There's some last known lat longs and some history there. But I always thought it'd be interesting. I still do. If you're an investor and you want to throw away lots of money, send it our way, because I'll put an expedition together to go find the Endurance. I think it'd be something, even highlighting the journey again in some form factor would be super impactful.
George Bell would be the cook.
He could be.
He'd be the cook.
He could
He'd
be
awesome at it.
He'd make Emperor Endangered
He
Penguin
would.
taste delicious.
Tacos. Emperor Penguin tacos. What's next for Stories of Survival, Mike?
Guys, we had talked about it, and I believe we have decided it's going to be the Donner Party.
Okay.
Which means that me and you are going to follow, and I say me, you, but also I mean Austin, because he'll have to hold the camera, be following the journey of the Donner Party.
Yeah, they came right through here.
They did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right through here.
Yep.
Just go west is where they went.
Yeah.
And index somewhere around South Lake Tahoe on the north side of the lake.
And that's another expedition. It's not really an expedition, but anything that could go wrong went wrong.
All the things we talked about in this
Murphy's
story,
Law, right?
just flip it upside down on its head, complete opposite.
Yeah.
Including, well, I won't even, spoil alert,
Yeah.
But I won't spoil the story, but it's a tragic story, a little bit of survival, a little bit of resilience, but mostly a bunch of suffering.
Yep.
Yeah.
Horrible.
Yeah. Stories of Survival is the show that we're talking about. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know some of the visual things you couldn't see if you're listening to this on a podcast, but we want to make sure that we give you this. If you're on YouTube, make sure you subscribe, leave that thumbs up, and tell your friends, tell your family, tell everybody you know, and do research on these kind of epic stories of resilience and survival. These only will give you the perspective you need in benefiting your life and preparedness. And I think it's something it's fun for us, but super beneficial for your lives.
Yeah, and if you have ideas or suggestions for stories, like we've already talked about the Donner Party, Lewis and Clark Expedition, stuff like that, and preferably in nice places. I don't want to go to Antarctica.
I know. Yeah, we won't do that.
Yeah.
But thanks so much, guys, for tuning in. Until next time, we'll see you later.